Today on Ascend, the Great Books podcast, we continue our journey through Dante's Inferno by exploring the first 7 pits of the 8th circle of hell, punishing those souls guilty of simple fraud. Amongst these, we will see seducers, flatterers, simonists, sorcerers, and many other sinners, and even run into some old friends like Jason and Tiresias. To guide us through our foray into fraud, we are joined by Noah and Gabriel from the Classic Learning Test. I greatly enjoyed talking to these guys, and I'm a big fan of the CLT and their tremendous work in restoring education in America. We'll discuss why flattery is in a deeper part of hell than murder or suicide, why Virgil wants people to know he's not a sorcerer, and why lying is contraceptive speech, a speech that denies the mind the fecundity of truth. I love hearing from you all on our Patreon or our X account. Please comment and let us know if you're enjoying the podcast. And I hope you'll join us for another excellent conversation on Dante's Inferno. Welcome to Ascend, the Great Books podcast. My name is Deacon Harrison Garlick. I'm a husband, father of 5, and serve as Chancellor and General Counsel for the Roman Catholic Diocese of Tulsa. We are recording on a beautiful evening here in rural Oklahoma. If you're new to Ascend, we're a weekly podcast that helps guide you through the great books. We have a whole series to help you read the Iliad, the Odyssey, Aeschylus's Oresteia, with more Greek plays and even Plato on the docket after we finish Dante's Inferno. You can check us out on Twitter, X, YouTube, Facebook, and Patreon. We appreciate all of our supporters. You can also visit thegreatbookspodcast.com, where we have written guides to help you read the great books, including a reader's guide to Dante's Inferno. That is incredibly helpful for you or for your small group. Today, we have our 5th episode on Dante's Inferno and are covering the first 7 pits of the 8th circle in hell, those condemned for simple fraud, found in Cantos 18 through 25. To help guide us through the 8th circle, we are joined by 2 distinguished guests from the Classic Learning Test, Mr. Noah Tyler, who serves as the CFO for CLT. Noah, how are you doing this evening?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you for being here. And Mr. Gabriel Blanchard, a staff writer for CLT. Gabriel, how are you doing?
Doing all right, thank you. How are you?
Doing well. All right, so Noah, maybe just kind of tee us up a little bit. Like, what is the Classic Learning Test?
Absolutely. So the Classic Learning Test is a test of reading and writing and mathematics. So not so dissimilar from the SAT that people are so familiar with, but rooted in the classics. So you'd see someone like Dante as a text used for reading comprehension, or Dickens used for grammatical corrections. And the math tends to be richer, deeper, allow you to use reasoning concepts and combine different skills and show different abilities. So there was a need for a new test, and we decided we would create this test to help drive curriculum and reinforce the best educational models out there.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Yeah, so it's like the SAT or ACT, but it's better, right?
But it's better. Yeah, but it's better.
It's much better.
300 colleges and all the right kinds of colleges, including University of Dallas and Hillsdale and Grove City, accept the test for admissions alongside of the other tests. And we're growing all the time. A lot of exciting scholarships that we're being added to, including in your state of Oklahoma. So big things on the horizon.
Yeah, good things are coming to Oklahoma, I believe. You also have tests for like elementary school kids, right? So like if you're going through certain grades, as they matriculate, they can take certain tests according to like the classical education, right?
Brand new in the last year, yeah. So 3rd through 8th now is our lower grade suite of assessments, and those are beautiful. I mean, they're not going to be Dante; they're going to be more like Winnie the Pooh or Beatrix Potter, some of the classic texts for children.
Yeah, no, very good. You don't have your 5th grade test being on the 8th circle of hell.
No Hegel or Kant on those 3rd grade tests.
So they will go directly from the 5th grade test to the 8th circle of hell. Like that is how we planned those exams.
That's good. No, that's very good. So Gabriel, tell me a little bit like about your role at CLT as like a staff writer.
For the most part, I run our blog, which we have been doing some series on sort of a crash course in the liberal arts for those who didn't get to have a liberal arts education. At least something sort of introductory and point you in the right direction. So like we had a series on sophistries. We did one on going through logic, like all the way down to like how does the square of opposition work? How do disjunctives work? All that kind of thing. And recently started a series on rhetoric. This is after we did 2 gigantic series, one profiling all of the authors on our author bank, which is from who's the most recent that we have now? Elie Wiesel, I think.
Mm-hmm.
From him all the way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh. And also a series on the great ideas, borrowed largely from Mortimer Adler's Syntopicon. If you're familiar with like the Great Books of the Western World set, that's sort of the not reference index, but idea index to that series. So
yeah, that book actually almost makes that whole series worth it. That's an excellent resource. Also, it's been a long time since I have thought about the square of opposition. And that I'm really thinking right now whether I could actually do it or not. I might need to like kind of refresh myself a little bit. We should probably also mention Jeremy Tate. So if people are on X, go follow Jeremy Tate. And he is the president of CLT, CEO, something like that.
Yep.
Great Con.
Founder, yes, all the titles. Yeah, so he's a great follow on X. If you're not following him already, go please check him out. And we've also had, I should mention, Dr. Jennifer Frey and Dr. Jessica Hooten-Wilson, who are already on the podcast to explain Dante's Inferno, are also on the advisory board for CLT, right. Along with myself. I was added only maybe a few weeks ago, actually. And so, yeah, so we're here to help promote the CLT cause however we can.
Fantastic. Glad you're on the board. You belong there.
Thanks. I know. I appreciate it. All right. Let's talk about Dante. So maybe Noah, just as like a preliminary, like how did you come to love Dante? How did you come to love the Dante's Inferno?
It's actually a fun story. I went to a small rural high school where there were no great books. And the social studies professor took one class period and just wrote names on the board of great thinkers we should just be cursorily familiar with. And so that was my first encounter of like, there's a guy named Dante, Divine Comedy. It wasn't funny. Moving on, Then I went to, it's also actually funny. Then I went to Grove City College where they have a very strong core curriculum. Even the frat boys and the football players have to take civ-lit, civilization literature. And we read the Inferno there, and I was absolutely taken with poetry and the story, the relationship between Dante and Virgil, the moral theology, the history, all of it. And then ended up in an Anglo-Catholic church with Gabriel. And we did a reading group where we did 3 cantos per month. So extremely slow trek through all of the books of the Divine Comedy. Then we took a year off and did Flannery O'Connor, and then went back to Dante and did it again. And then with the new translation out by Michael Palma, I got it for Christmas and started digging it again. And so just love the multi-dimensional aspects of Dante.
I love that there's people like you that will cover only a few cantos a month, because it makes me feel a lot better about the slow pace of my own reading groups, where I always feel like I'm dragging everyone down. I'm like, no, like we can read Homer and we'll take 6 months just to read the Iliad. So now I really enjoy that because I'm going to use that when they're like, why are we taking 10 months to read the Republic? I'm like, listen, I know a guy in their group only read like 3 cantos a month. So I actually really appreciate knowing that exists. Gabriel, what about yourself? How did you come to love Dante?
I went to a tiny classical school for high school. It had actually only opened a few years ago. I wound up being part of the first graduating class. And they were really big on sort of a great books education. And the Inferno was one of the things that we read when I was in, I think, 10th grade there. I fell in love. Despite the fact that I was a hardcore Protestant at the time, I went out and bought a copy of Purgatorio, fell in love with that. Dante wound up being like part of my conversion to Roman Catholicism. And it was just, I have rarely found another author as profound, both artistically and spiritually at the same time. And that was before I found out about Charles Williams.
Can I give a brief digression just while we're on the topic of introductions to Dante?
Of course.
Heard a lecture by Anthony Esolen on the Vita Nuova, his earlier work, and had never read it until there's also a new translation of that out by Joseph Luzzi. And so I picked that up for Christmas as well and read that and was profoundly disappointed. It was not
really
different.
It was not what I expected at all.
Did you think it was going to be like the comedy?
Not like the comedy, but I thought maybe a lot more narrative. It's like 1/3 some narrative, random stuff he did as a, kind of a weird teenager. And then 1/3 of explaining the poem he's about to write. And then 1/3 of the poem he's going to write about his long lost love or something. It's just like, I found it very odd. It's still good poetry. It's still interesting if you love Dante. But I think I'm sticking with the comedy myself.
Yeah, there's no one walking around with their head twisted on backwards or anything like that.
No,
nothing fun.
I was like looking between the lines for that.
To be fair, that does run out fast in Inferno.
I will say on his earlier poetry, I think one of the main lessons I would pull from that, pull into the Inferno, would be that obviously he's writing that courtly love poetry, but I think his poems that he did earlier, I think, are probably the best insight on how to understand Beatrice, because as you probably noticed in the poem that he has in there, he's praising Beatrice. She's like his muse. He's praising her, but then he'll say things like, and then your beauty led me to him. He switches the pronouns, and he has this interesting idea that Beatrice can, in my own words, Beatrice can really be an icon of God, right? Her beauty is actually an invitation for his soul to contemplate God, and it's in the ancients. Obviously, it's very Platonic, but it's also in the early church fathers. Saint John Climacus, in his Ladder of Divine Ascent, will praise the monk that can see a woman and glorify God, her creator, because of her beauty, right? And he says it's a very rare thing that can happen. And so I think it's really interesting because those poems that you mentioned do give kind of an insight. Unfortunately, Beatrice doesn't play a huge role in the Inferno, but as you kind of move on, I think too, but she throws us for a loop because it's like, well, she's not his wife. Like, who is she? Like, what's she doing? And I think that's one of the best ways to see her, and those poems are somewhat exemplary of that, is she really becomes an icon of God's beauty, right? Her own beauty is, and it's an invitation for the soul to ascend. It's an invitation for the soul to go up. And this is one of the things that if you've read the whole comedy, which I know both of you guys have, but maybe a lot of our listeners haven't, is that at some point, like, Dante's own love is going to have to transition. Can Dante's love transition from Beatrice to God? Is he actually making this journey because of Beatrice, like because he wants to see her, or because he wants to see God? And that's part of his like maturation process. But I think that those poems are really good. And if you guys have, those who are listening, if you picked up the Esolen translation, the follow along, going by memory, I think Esolen has some of that poetry in his appendices. So you can kind of see that play. So yeah, that's a good mention, because I think that actually haunts the text a certain way.
Well, I think he goes from, in the very first, in the first cantos, he goes from just terror, like he's not really looking to get to Beatrice, he's just terrified, and then he latches on to Virgil, and it's a slow kind of drawing up. It comes from a very earthly, level.
It's a recovery of his humanity, because he's almost lost that when he's astray in the dark wood.
Yeah, but by this point, he's got a lot of security. By the point we're picking up, he and Virgil are tight, like they're kind of cheering each other on in some ways, laughing at each other, and it's kind of fun to watch their maturity.
I think Dante the Pilgrim might have matured a bit by this point, right? Like, he's trying to find his courage. That's another thing he's trying to find. We're trying to see if his pity, right?
He's
his will.
A lot less than he was.
Say again?
He's fainting a lot less than he was.
Right. He's grown up, right? He's fainting a lot less. I think we actually see the last time that he cries and weeps is actually in this section. Yeah, he is maturing, right? This is something that we're watching, particularly as first time readers. We're watching his pity. Does his pity align with the divine will? Is he pitying people? Does he understand why they're there? We've seen him earlier, I think, really kind of get taken by Francisca. Is that starting to mature a bit? Is his will harmonizing with God? And these are kind of some of the things that we've been talking about as we've kind of moved through the Inferno, under the understanding that Dante the Pilgrim, in a lot of ways, really is an analog to us. We are the pilgrim. We're the one that actually has to grow and mature as we kind of go on this journey with him.
The moral level of the allegory.
Okay. All right, well, let's jump into the text then. Let's look at Canto 18. So maybe let's give like a little sketch about where are we in hell, right? Where are we in the Inferno? And so maybe I'll give like a little mapping, and maybe if you guys have something to add. So mainly we've been tracking that, hell has like two major parts. So we've got upper hell, which is the sins of incontinence. So these are things like lust. These are things that there's a good, and you have a disordered appetite towards that good. So we had lust, we had wealth would have been another one, food would have been another, even anger, right? We saw wrath, these types of things.
Mm-hmm.
So that's upper hell. Lower hell is characterized by malice, and so then it's broken into two separate categories. And so we see violence, and then we at the very pit of hell where we are now, the 8th and 9th circle, it's fraud. And so then what's the distinction, I guess, between 8 and 9, if they're both in the broader category of fraud? Like, what do we make this? Well, I don't know what other translators say. Estlin, I think it's Estlin, or maybe Musa, calls this simple fraud, right? Simple. 9 is going to be complex. And we're going to have some examples to kind of show us what does that mean? Like, what's the actual juxtaposition that's being shown there? But in 8th, what we're going to see is fraud. It's going to be simple, but it's going to be malicious. We're going to have to kind of keep that in mind, because I think we're going to see a few sins here that we're like, really? That's worse than being Attila the Hun? Like, they do this? And I think we kind of have to take a step back. We also tracked with like the animals. So in Canto 1, we saw the she-wolf was kind of the incontinence. The lion was violence. And now we're finally down to the leopard, to fraud.
And we crossed down on Geryon, right? And as a symbol of fraud, an animal of sorts, with a friendly face and a scorpion's tail.
Like a manticore.
Yeah, like a manticore. Yeah, no, very good. Yeah, so that's kind of where we are, like in the broad overall journey. So let's get into the text. Canto 18, the 8th circle, the fraudulent.
Just maybe add to the context there that there's plenty of counterintuitive, like many people in the Christian setting would say, well, obviously lust is the worst, so we're already inverting a lot of people's inclinations when they look at sins in the world. But I think when we get into fraud, we're talking about calculating and reasoning as one of the highest functions of man. And when that highest function is perverted, that in some ways that in many ways is worse, or the worst deviation from the highest gift that God has given. Or that's how I understand the entire, whether it's simple or complex, why fraud is at the bottom of the pit.
There's I don't know exactly where it comes from, but I know that there is a saying in Latin that corruptio optimi pessima, the corruption of the best is the worst. And since fraud is specifically a sin that involves not just the animal part of humanity, but its intellect, that is what makes it worst in Dante's eyes.
Yeah, no, very good. Yeah, that's a good add. Yeah, you can think of Lucifer, right? So the highest angel becomes the greatest demon. Yeah, no, that's my understanding of it as well. That basically fraud is a corruption of the intellect. And so we're rational animals. And so this is a particularly human sin. So we have the gift, the imago Dei, we have the image of God in us. We have this intellect, which is really an invitation for us to know and love God, and we can corrupt that. And I think that's great, because again, as we kind of work through this, we're going to see sins that we're like, why do we really think these are so bad? Right. Mm-hmm. And so we have to kind of understand what's the context here. I think with lust too, one of the things we mentioned on the previous episode is you have to make distinction between why is a sin bad? So is it bad in and of its nature, or is it bad because of its like severity in the culture? Mm-hmm. And so Dante saying lust is at the top doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be severe insofar as how common it is. So like I think of like Our Lady of Fatima, we'll talk about that more sins or more sinners go to hell for lust than any other sin. Mm-hmm. So it might be at the top of the Inferno, but you still go to hell for it, which is overall a negative.
Well, we're going to get into our actual circles, but one of the most remarkable things in the whole Inferno is the people chased by bees, and the numerous, like, they're not even worthy of any circles of hell. They didn't even make the cut, but they're still in hell, and they're uncountable. Like, they're the lukewarm ones that were spit out of God's mouth, and they don't even dignified by a particular category.
Yeah, and it's particularly a modern sin, if that makes sense. Like it's almost that sin of being like the lukewarm, the milk toast. They stood for nothing. They march after the banner, etc. Tends to be like a particular modern sin, and one that we would even. I think Dr. Frey talked about this when she was on. One that we would even praise. Like they're kind of agnostic. They're not they're not too into anything. Like do whatever you want to, just don't be overly into it. Don't be zealous. And so like everything that we typically praise in our culture, that one particular vestibule of hell where they're all marching, like that tends to be like something that we actually would praise as almost like a virtue. So no, I love that part. He also, it's Dante's invention, but he also mentions angels in there. There were angels that could not decide either between following God or not. And so they're all marching now behind this banner with bees and wasps and all kinds of things. So no, that's very good. Yeah, so let's look at the eighth circle. So the eighth circle has an interesting structure that we should probably talk about. So we're expecting to see simple fraud, but then it has these, my understanding is that it has 10 pockets, ditches, whatever you want to call them, ravines in this. So you kind of see, and I think, one thing that people talk about is, Dante flew down right on Geryon. And so he actually got kind of an aerial view of how this works. And so the eighth circle has these 10 ditches, and in each ditch, we will see then a different species of simple fraud. Okay. So the first one that we're going to run into, right? What sin is punished in this kind of like first ditch is we have the seducers and the panderers. So we have those who seduced people. That makes more sense. But then like the panderers, this is like a pimp, right? One that actually puts someone out to do this sin. So why are these? How are these so bad? Why are these down here in the eighth circle?
Idea of seduction does seem to contain in it, like there's a suggestion that this is different from fornication, that there's an idea of being led on, as it were, or of being deceived. And certainly in the idea of pandering, there's an idea, terrible sentence. Anyway, certainly in the concept of pandering, there is an active involvement of the intellect that is required, that is something more and other than just a failure of self-discipline. I am struck by the fact that the Malbauge of the Panderers has a sort of foreshadowing all the way back up with Paolo and Francisca, because she specifically mentions the book that the two of them were reading when they lost control, and that it was specifically named for Galliot or Galahalt, who is a character in Arthurian myth, who in some versions of the story was the go-between of Lancelot and Guinevere. So even though their sin was not this sin, it's already hinting at what lies beneath them.
Yeah, that's interesting because in that example that he gives back up in Lust, that's a really good distinction, because he does kind of stress through Francesca's story that it was almost equal, right? One didn't seduce the other. They were both reading this book and etc. So no, that's a good distinction, because here we have someone who has corrupted their intellect. They've put it at the purpose of seducing another. And so that, yeah, usually obviously for some type of sexual gain, but it doesn't fall into lust. It falls into a type of fraud because of its a corruption of the intellect. I think that's a good distinction.
Yeah, it's a crime of passion versus a calculating crime. And so if you're seducing, you're setting out to you set up the rose petals on the bed and whatever, and you go out and you say fine words and lure them in. And like from the Proverbs, where the simple man, is led in like a fish on a hook, and the seductress gets him.
Which does make Jason a very good example, because, I mean, if there's anything that you could say about the myth of Jason and Medea, it's that while it was not a virtuous love, as she went on to prove to great excess, like, she was absolutely captivated by Jason. Like, that is the point of the story, that she was genuinely in love with him, and he was not in love with her.
So can you, just for those who might not be familiar with Jason, can you just give like the quick summary of his story?
Yes. So about a generation before the Trojan War, Jason and the Argonauts go to Colchis, which is supposed to be roughly in the modern-day state of Georgia. Country state, not U.S. state. And the reason that they're going there is Quest of the Golden Fleece. I forget why it's important, but, it's gold. Everybody wants that. And the way that he obtained it was with the help of the king of Colchis' daughter, Medea, who was a very powerful witch, actually related to Circe. And so she aided Jason in getting the fleece and fled with him when they left to take it back to Greece. And he said that he was going to marry her, and then very much didn't. Married someone else. Now, a lot of people feel that Medea's response of killing not only his actual bride, but the two sons that she and Jason had was tacky. I tend to agree with this. But, Jason was wrong too, which,
puts him in this circle.
I think it's interesting too to kind of look at then how Dante judges the pagans, because obviously all the pagans are going to fall short of Christian virtue, but then some pagans, right? So some pagans he judges to have done, well. So like obviously we had in Limbo, I think Hector was there. We also had the philosophers, but you also had obviously some Muslims as well. So it's interesting too, because I think one of the themes that we've been tracking through all this is Dante's soteriology, right? Who is saved? And while we've very kind of painfully parsed out that Dante's text is not a treatise on eschatology, right? He's not here to tell us who is and is not in hell. That's why he can add these mythological characters and do things like this. Even the popes, we'll see that here in a few minutes.
He's at least forcing you to think about what sorts of people should be in hell.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It's interesting on the pagan side to then see how he makes certain judgments and how he judges them in the tradition. So you have like a pagan hero.
Like if they knew better, then that is to them a sin, along the same lines as St. Paul. Mm-hmm. And if their code did not condemn something, as for instance, the Roman code did not necessarily condemn suicide before Christ. And, we meet Cato, not even here in the Inferno, but in Purgatorio.
Yeah, pagan suicide is the first person they meet in Purgatory. Yeah, so I think it's just a good thing for us to be tracking is how does he actually play out this salvation? And I like that too, is like, was the act wrong that they did, not just simply according to natural law or according later to Revelation, but was it wrong that they knew it was wrong? Was it wrong to them when they did it? I think that's a good distinction to move forward on.
I wonder if heresy or like some sort of heretical position or divisiveness in the church wouldn't be akin to seduction in some way, that you're luring people out of the true church, and yet that the heretics are not as deep in hell, right?
No, the circle of the heretics is the sixth, but I think the difference is the ones who are punished in the sixth circle are those who were heretics, as opposed to being heresiarchs, people who preached heresy.
Yeah.
That, I think, is going to be the difference between the heretics in the sixth circle and the sowers of discord in the eighth, right, who are even deeper than anything we're going to be looking at.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, very good. What about the contrapasso? So we've been talking about contrapassos on the podcast. How is the punishment here of each ditch within the eighth circle tailored to the particular sin? What's the contrapasso here?
Have we described what's happening in this first ditch?
No, we've just described the who is here, right, and that he sees Jason. But yeah, the contrapasso then is the introduction to what's actually happening in this ditch, right? What is it that is actually happening to the sinners?
So this is the two lines of people walking in opposite directions, and they're being whipped. Like if they slow down a little bit, they get whipped, and they don't wait for a second or third whip. They pick up their heels and keep going on. And since they're walking in a circle, I mean, it's just fun the way that he describes. It's like the Romans when they cross the bridge, like the outside has to walk with a little bit longer steps, Some of the little descriptions are kind of comical and fun in light of the fact that these people are suffering. They're totally naked, and so there's no real protection, and they just for all eternity just marching in circles.
Yeah, so that Dante, as we kind of just explained, right? He's not kind of writing a treatise on eschatology. Dante is a teacher, and so he's trying to teach us, I think, primarily about human desire, about the human soul, vice and virtue, these types of things. And so each contrapasso is supposed to be pedagogical. So, for instance, in Lust, we saw that they're blown about by the winds, which really confused me when I first read this. But then you see, oh, well, that's because that's how they treated their soul. Right, they allowed their soul to be blown about by the passions. You see the same thing with the gluttonous, right? There's sin. It's very kind of like pig, porcine scene. They're wallowing in the muck, and that's how they treated their soul. They had like an irrational desire for food. Cerberus is like eating the slime that they're lying in. What's the pedagogy here with the whips, though? I was thinking about this because it wasn't immediately clear to me. A few things that did occur to me was, one, I think Dante throughout the Eighth Circle, we'll see in different places, plays with imagery of the tongue, right? Because that's one of the things that speech, the corrupted speech, is a big part of this. So if the intellect is an appetite that wants to satiate on truth, and so its purpose is to find truth, the purpose of our speech is to communicate truth. We don't think about our speech as a telos. Our speech has a purpose. And so it's there to communicate truth. And so we see then that a lie is contrary. It's not just like bad. It's actually a corruption and contrary to the very nature of speech itself. And, in Christianity, we don't really have a noble lie. We don't really have like a good lie, right? We have justified murder. You can defend yourself. We have these kinds of things. There's certain things we have, that things can be justified. We have no justified lie. And I think that one reason, going back to
Rahab.
What?
We have Rahab and James.
We do have Rahab and St. Thomas.
Save someone's life rather than to seduce someone, which are fairly different.
Yeah, she is. She also is in a lineage of Christ, right? Yeah, maybe not to take us too far afield, but yeah, St. Thomas Aquinas has to do a lot of work on Rahab and Abraham. And there's another example in the Old Testament too, in which he has to give some examples of how those are contextualized. But broadly speaking, right? And I think one way, Noah, going back to your point on why then is fraud so bad, is not only is it a corruption of our particular intellect, which is the gift, but it's also an act that is actually very anti-Christ, right? Because Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. He is the Logos. He actually is kind of the ordering principle of reality itself. He is truth. And so to lie then, right, sometimes we talk about him too in the beginning of John, is the eternal word, the word that gives structure, that gives reality, that gives truth to things. So to lie is a very anti-Christ act. And so it just kind of goes back to your point about why is fraud down here in such a low section of hell and its severity. And I think that's one of the reasons too, because even from you could say that the corruption of the intellect is a natural argument. It being kind of an anti-Christ act is a very supernatural argument. And so you'll see imagery here with like tongues. And so one thing of the whipping on the, like, again, going back to the pedagogy on the contrapasso, is of that the whips are like the damaging of the tongues, right? They're being whipped. Another thing I think that's there is particularly, maybe not so much on the seducers, but particularly on the panderers that kind of pushed people right into situations. They pushed people. So you have the whips coming in. There's some imagery there. But any thoughts like on this? Because sometimes the contrapassos are very clear. This one, I felt like I had to kind of stop and, I mean, obviously it's bad to be whipped by demons. That's a given. We can say that's a given. But trying to figure out like what's the pedagogy there, like how's it tailor into the sin, wasn't immediately apparent to me.
My bigger connection was on the nakedness, that they've got nothing to cover themselves with, that they used all of their smoothness and their lies and their words to kind of create a persona and to create a perception and to deceive. And all of that is stripped bare, and they've got no way to defend themselves. So the whipping is just the whipping, but the nakedness is the real punishment that they cannot escape. The stings of the whips, because they've been stripped of of what they're accustomed to or what they had become accustomed to.
Yeah, that's good. I guess my default, I mean, just kind of maybe pushing into my own imagination, I guess my default is that they were all naked in the Inferno, but maybe that's not accurate. Maybe it's only when it's mentioned that they're naked.
Are Paolo and Francisca naked?
I do not recall that it was stated either way.
Yeah, so one thing, I mean, either way, Noah, what I would lean into is, why is their nakedness mentioned here? So even if all the souls, right, are naked, because I don't quite remember. Well, actually, we're gonna have one here that has like a cloak, but that's like, that's an outlier.
Yeah.
Even if they are, then I think pedagogically you would ask, well, why is Dante the poet mentioning the nakedness again, right? I think that would be a flag then to kind of go into what you mentioned.
In the depths.
Right. All right, very good. Any other thoughts on the first ditch? All right, let's look at the second one. This is the one I think that really throws people for a loop. We've already kind of done a kind of a foretaste of it because we've kind of used it as an example. But we get into the second ditch, and who do we find here but the flatterers? The flatterers, people that engage in flattery. So you're telling me, to go back to our earlier point, that people who engage in flattery commit a more vile sin than, say, people that are wrathful, people who engage in sexual immorality, than tyrants, Attila the Hun, suicides. I mean, think of all the people that we've had so far, people who flatter each other. I mean, what's going on here? What is Dante's intent?
Here, I think, is one of the places where Charles Williams really shines. And he may have come up in the show before, but even if he has, I'm going to plug him again. Charles Williams, The Figure of Beatrice, some of the best commentary I have ever read on any book. Absolutely fantastic. But one of the points that he makes, because he made a particular study of what he calls the romantic theology of Dante, and it shows up in Williams's own poetry as well. He makes the point that Thais, in particular, the prostitute who's mentioned here, she adopts the language of love, of romantic love, to stroke the ego of this customer. And when, as Dante does and as Williams does, when you approach love in the first place as a way of the soul, that is a kind of sacrilege. It is taking something that could have been real and making it fake. It's BSing.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. One thing, because this really caught my attention the first time I read the Inferno, like really just threw me for a loop. And then this really is what led me then into understanding the distinction between incontinence and malice. Okay, great. But then also I think kind of going back to Noah's point of understanding from like a natural standpoint, the corruption of the intellect, the corruption of the highest, ends up being the lowest. And so, but I think too, just on flattery itself, I think one distinction we should make is that this is flattery done with malice. Right, so it is an intention to deceive. So this is not just like a kind word you say to someone.
This Christmas party where you say nice dress, but it's a terrible dress.
Right, exactly. It's like, well, you're going to the 8th circle, bud. Sorry, right? Like these are. I mean, I don't know. Maybe they're white lies, or we say things like this in polite society. These like flattering. I want to make a big distinction that I don't think that's what Dante means, because it has to be one with malice. Right, it has to be one where you're actually intending to deceive. And I think, too, kind of leaning back into the purpose of speech. So another way to look at this, maybe to use a term, is that lying is contraceptive speech. Like lying is a type of speech that has been contracepted from its actual purpose. Right. Mm-hmm. So when I communicate with words, hopefully what's happening is there's a certain fecundity that I'm sharing an idea with you, right? I'm trying to share an idea, which hopefully is true. And then your mind can actually receive that and digest it, right? And then hopefully there's something that happens there that you've actually received this idea. So when we lie, we have to understand that it creates an artificial reality in the recipient. So your words are supposed to be, the fecundity of your words is supposed to be truth. It's supposed to be reality. You're actually helping your neighbor's mind conform to reality, right? That's our working definition of truth. Truth is the conformity of the mind to reality. So you're trying to help your neighbor's mind, right? Like conform to truth. Like tonight, you guys are trying to help me understand the Inferno. But when you lie, you basically help your neighbor's mind conform to an artificiality, to something that's not real. And I think that flattery then in that context, particularly seen in a malicious context, can really be insanely damaging. And actually, I think one of the things too that I think maybe might not be mentioned enough is the concept of mutual flattery. And what I mean by that is like, you're doing a good job. Don't let anyone tell you that you don't, you can't do better. Don't let anyone speak down to you. Don't. And then you're like, oh, you know what? You're also doing a great job. I also like what you're doing. And like, we actually create these cultures of incompetency based off this type of like flattery. And that one's a little different because like, what's the malice there? But it's actually like towards yourself. Like you understand that if you flatter this person, there's a certain benefit that you receive back. And then if there's a mutual flattery, it creates these artificial realities that can actually kind of envelop entire communities. And then when that happens, is they become incompetent, they collapse. No one could ever have seen this coming. Well, yes, everyone saw this coming, right? Except those that were kind of inside it. So I think that flattery, and maybe I'm just trying to carry water for Dante here, but I do think, that flattery can be very malicious and can really take people off guard, divorce their minds from reality, and then cause a lot of damage.
There's somebody that's also on our academic board at CLT, Lexi Hudson, who, her experience working in the government briefly, she reflects on this in her book. And it was just lots of flattery. Washington, D.C. is like a city built on flattery. That's what they do there. It's the business they're in. We work with some people who are in the friends business. And I'm like, ooh, the friends business. That phrase just grates me the wrong way.
That is very uncomfortable.
But if you're in DC, I don't know if you've read Atlas Shrugged, but you got to have your man in Washington. You got to have, and the businessman trying to work an honest business is like, I don't need a man in Washington, and he learns that he needs a man in Washington. Like if you don't have the flattery engine going, you're not able to grease the wheels and get the things that you need. So it's a dark world, and I feel like it's a lot of what happens in DC that's going to end up in this particular circle.
Yeah, that's good.
I also, just riffing on what you're saying, Deacon Garlick, Gabriel also got me to read Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. And, so my mind is just turning on how does an entire society flip into Holocaust mode without realizing it? They just like boiled their own frog somehow. And a lot of it did have to do with language. They had language rules. You can't call it extermination, liquidation. You can't even call it that. We're going to call it, resettlement, quote unquote resettlement. And then, these countries that we've taken over, they'll give up their Jews for resettlement. Great. Let's call it that, and even at the trial, gassing is just a medical act, just the distortion of words, where, if it's just a medical act, euthanasia, no big deal. It's just a medical act. We lie to ourselves and we create, evil cultures that truly belong in the deepest possible imaginable pit of hell by distorting our language.
It is, I think, true that there are people who are honestly deceived, but I think most of us, a lot of the time, the issue is much more that we could know the truth if we wanted to, but it would take a lot of work and cost our ego a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that. That kind of goes in that mutual. That kind of goes into that mutual flattery, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I know that I'm benefiting from this in a certain way. I think too, Noah, going back to your point, obviously the mind moves from grammar to logic to rhetoric, right? We have to understand our terms and then how to apply them, and then we can talk about them. And so I think that it is pretty standard that we're seeing that, if they want to change, right, the proverbial they, if they want to change our logic, the first thing they do is they change our grammar. And so we start gutting, you see this in our culture, right? We start gutting words of their meaning. And then later, you do that for a few years, and you throw out logical arguments that never would have survived, a decade ago. And now they just all of a sudden make sense to everyone. Well, how do they make sense? Well, because the words have changed. So you just take like love, like love is love. Well, that doesn't mean anything, but we get so used to hearing that love basically has no boundaries. It actually has no nature. It has no actual characteristics or infrastructure to it. Then you're like, well, is this love? Is that love? Like, then you lose your capacity to make distinctions. So when love has to be applied, logically speaking, like it doesn't mean anything. Therefore, it can apply to everything. Right. So no, I think the way that we change this, and you can give 1,000 examples of all the terms in our culture that a lot of money has been poured into to try and change the grammar. And the reason they do that is because it will naturally change the logic. If you come out with the logical arguments first without changing the grammar, no one will follow you. Mm-hmm. So you kind of got to erode this to a certain degree. So no, I think it's a great example.
I missed 1984 in high school, but I just read it in the last couple of months, and it's a lot about rewriting the dictionary. I mean, there's a major subplot the whole time of getting this dictionary rewritten.
Brave New World's better, just saying.
I know. I'll get that next. I want to knit us across the ditches, though, in some way, and keep on the theme of calculation, because I think that's one of the keys to the 10 ditches. And we've got the seducers who are calculating a seduction to get, and we've got on the other side we've got graft and grift and theft all coming, and they're stealing. They're using their creative gifts to grab something for themselves in a very calculating way. And I think that if we put flattery mostly in that context of I knew I'm going to do a hostile takeover of your business, and so I'm going to flatter you and butter you up and take you out to wine and make you, and then I'm going to like stab you in the back, that's the kind of like, whoa, that is some bad flattery. That's, very, very intentional. We didn't slide into that as a habit. We dreamed that up and hatched a plan and ambushed, using this flattery technique.
It's premeditated.
Well, maybe we'll take that as a jumping point into Canto 19. So looking at the 8th circle, and we get into our third ditch that Dante the Pilgrim and Virgil come through. So we get simony, right? Which I don't know if we think about too often. But one thing that really strikes me here in this canto is Dante the poet, right, starts off with this thing about, simony's named after Simon, right, who wanted to, they sell things. They were going to sell, could they buy the apostolic power? Could you buy this healing power the disciples have? So simony in general is typically seen as the selling of ecclesiastical goods, particularly offices. So you pay me, you become the priest, you become a bishop, you become these types of things. It's interesting because I think one thing to watch throughout the Inferno is you can kind of tell when Dante has a particular hatred for a sin. And I would say it's not necessarily, it's like not necessarily in the contrapasso, but it's in these like tirades that he goes on. So all of a sudden he kind of breaks from the narrative and will give like these kind of tirades against this sin. And it's interesting when Dante the poet speaks, because when Dante the poet speaks, we are assuming that he has gone through his entire journey. And so he's giving this commentary after already going through purgatory and up through heaven. And I think that's a heavy thing to think about, because he's actually already, this is the mature Dante. Dante the poet is theoretically the Dante who has been matured and purified throughout this journey. Like, for instance, an example was earlier in the Inferno, we saw that Dante the poet talked about that seeing a sinner being punished still delighted him to this day. And so that's a huge claim, because he's saying that this, I think that was in Wrath, to see this guy get dragged back under the boat by these angry souls is still something that delights him even after he's matured like through his whole journey, which to a certain degree we can claim to, because he's trying to align his will to the divine will that put that sinner there. So here, I think with simony, this is a particular sin that Dante hates. It's also, I think, one of my favorite contrapassos, just because it's, at least the first time when I read it, it's another one where I'm like, what does this have to do with simony? They get shoved in a hole in the ground. So they come down into the third ditch. What do they see? They see all these little legs up in the air. Right? They see all these little legs sticking out of the air, all these holes. And it's like, that's what simony is. But there's a wonderful line in this canto where he actually makes this play on words, explicit, that they're pocketed in the earth as they pocketed coins for the selling of church goods, right? So now they're the thing that's pocketed into the floor of hell. And once I understood that, I just thought this was an excellent contrapasso. And what even makes it more horrific is when you realize that there's more than one soul in each hole. And so there's, who do we have here? We're going to have, what is this, Pope Nicholas, right? Is the one that's actually still has his feet out, but he's waiting for Boniface the eighth, right? But King Minos is going to throw him down, and then he gets shoved into the same hole. And so they all get crammed into this thing, and then Boniface's legs will be sticking out. But there's all these souls that are crammed down into the floor of hell in this tiny little hole, being pocketed like they pocketed money for church goods. I mean, I think the pedagogy here of the contrapasso is really brilliant.
I'd actually highlight something else even in around lines 13 through, where is it? 13 through neighborhood of 20. One of the pretexts on which Dante was banished from Florence was that he had committed sacrilege because he had broken down part of the wall of the font in the Florentine baptistry because there was a child drowning in it. Which,
he's kind of mad.
So he did not take that well, and I don't blame him. But he brings that up here, and the thing that strikes me about this image is the way it's an anti-baptism. That they aren't being immersed or even like held the way a priest would hold a baby for a baptism. They're being dunked down into fire. Like it's as opposite from baptism as it can be.
Instead of raised up out of water.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. Another way to look at that imagery too, when we see them being upside down, is that there's like a satanic perversion of man. So that upside down man is that, naturally kind of image of man being corrupted, because man is typically, as we've talked about, right, he has an intellect, and then he has the will, and then he has his passion. So that kind of corresponds then with the what's highest on the human body moving to the lowest. So then there's that picture of satanic man of when he's turned upside down, because then obviously his lower passions are what's highest, right? And the intellect is what is lowest. And so there's two, I think, kind of playing off of that, of them being upside down for all eternity, right? That they allowed, right, this passion, this need for for the goods that they got, right, like gold and things like this. It's not always gold. I think like Pope Nicholas, I think there was a note that Pope Nicholas, a lot of it was him just moving his family. Like he used it to like benefit his family and the power of his house and things like this. Boniface, I don't know. Am I allowed to give a defense of Boniface? Is that a good idea? I don't know if that's a good idea or not. But Boniface,
we don't think it's a good idea.
Well, I mean, so we just have all these popes raining down into the floor of hell. So maybe we have to give a little bit of a defense, or maybe just clarification. We'll call it a clarification. So one, Dante has a particular hatred for Boniface the Eighth, because it's basically Boniface the Eighth's pressure into Florence that is kind of the proximate cause of him being exiled. So he has a particular hatred. And one of the things we've been tracking is Dante's political views. And there's what I mean by that is, like, you can get really sucked into Florentine politics. And if that interests you, God bless you. You go for it. You figure it all out. Like, 2 weeks ago, we had on Dr. Jason Baxter, and he gave this like wonderful, like 8-minute talk, like just straight about like trying to understand all the parties in Florence and the whites and the blacks and how this all worked. It was beautiful. But from like a larger architectonic standpoint, what we're seeing is Dante just believes that there's two powers. This is duo sunt. He believes there's two powers. There's the temporal imperial power, and then there is the apostolic spiritual power. And because sometimes you see Dante's critiques of the papacy misread, like somehow Dante's like a proto-liberal, like he's going to install liberalism and like the Pope has too much temporal authority. And that's not the case. What he thinks is that the Pope has too much temporal authority taken away from the imperial, from the emperor. You remember, Italy's fractured into all these city-states. And so when you don't have a strong temporal power, right, you suffer. The common good suffers. And so the papacy during this time period has amassed a good amount of temporal power in the absence of a strong empire. And so Dante kind of pushes back against this, but Boniface the Eighth, I think he gets blamed for this. But Boniface the Eighth is not known for selling church offices. He's not known for his simony. So it's interesting here that, I was reading Eslin's commentary on this, that Boniface the Eighth seems to be here under some kind of like vague notion of he's kind of stolen. He's using the church to gain temporal power, if that makes sense, right? So he's kind of stolen some type of authority from the emperor, and he's using the ecclesiastical structure for his own benefit. So it's a much larger picture, but it's interesting because it's a critique on a very high level of like what should the balance be between the temporal power and the spiritual power, as these two powers guide man. The church will talk about that these two powers are the two lights. It's like the sun and the moon. If you have good temporal power and good spiritual power, your pilgrimage on earth is good. They help guide you, right? They illuminate. You see the way. If we don't have a good temporal power, if there's corruption, if it's fractured, I mean, how well can you be a good Catholic when Florence is constantly killing each other and fighting over all these politics, right? And so, so I just mentioned that not to maybe give a defense of Boniface VIII, even though I do like one of his encyclicals that he did. But Dante puts him here for a very particular reason, if that makes sense.
One thing that I found really helpful in the Serge commentary on the Inferno was her explanation of simony, which was, she gave a slightly broader one, which was that it is the sale of a sacrament. And she said that it is normally found in the sense of like the sale of church offices and relics and so forth. But she also gave the example that a mercenary marriage is the sale of a sacrament.
And what do you mean by that?
Marrying someone for their money. And that to me shed a really helpful light on the fact that I think we sometimes in theology in general and morals in particular sometimes get a little bit fixated on terms and categorization, which I love terms and categorization. I am all about that. It is my jam. But I think that what occasionally gets lost or maybe obscured is a better word. There I am doing it. What I think sometimes gets obscured is that the point of the words is the ideas, and the idea of simony or whatever else has slightly fuzzier edges than the term tends to.
I think it's a fair point, because one of the things we've seen is that the sins tend to be slightly broader than they first appear, if that makes sense. So when we, I think Father Thomas pointed this out, that the sexual sins that we find in the seventh circle in the sands, that was actually contextualized as just like a larger category of sins that dealt with sterility, right? That there's no fecundity here. And so we've seen this a few times in which a particular sin is mentioned, but it's actually kind of a stand-in for a larger category. So no, I like that. I'd have to think about that more. Particularly, I like the example of marrying someone for their money, but then you're using a sacrament to do it. Does that count then as a simony? I like that.
I wonder, I mean, is this, though we said that maybe, flattery might be a modern thing, or is this not a modern thing? Like, we don't really have to worry about simony in this day and age. So we'll talk about the history and how popes used to sell offices, but we don't have to deal much with that. Or
I mean, we're not safe from it, but we don't have it on the scale that they had it in the Middle Ages.
Yeah,
it was like unreal.
Yeah. And Deacon, how much do you want for that relic that's behind you there?
Right, that's going to go on for sale at the end of the podcast. Yeah, I think that, well, it depends on how broad, right? So I don't mean to like push into things, but I'm always really skeptical when we think a sin has disappeared. This is how we wake up one day and no one knows what usury is, which is kind of like a fish waking up and not understanding what water is. And so, sometimes these things like acedia would be another one, right? So there's a theory that, if we don't think a sin is around anymore, or again, that grammar logic rhetoric, we struggle to define it. It's usually not because it's gone. It's because it's ubiquitous, and we've become so accustomed to it that we don't see it. And simony, I don't know. I mean, I actually think I was thinking about this and contemplating it, and also how much I wanted to lean into it. But no, I think this happens a lot more in the church if you contextualized it broadly. As does the church ever change what she's doing for the sake of money? Where are things for sale in the church? I think there are intangibles that are for sale, and that's a little more difficult to track down. But then you'd probably have to lean into the malice section and say, well, is this really being malicious, or is this just a culture that's popped up and it's become normative? And so we kind of need, maybe a prophetic voice to start calling this back down, but it's not malicious per se.
Which I think is important in knowing how we are to respond to a culture like that. Because I do think that there are cultures that get like that because there are malicious people at work, and there are people either who don't understand that or are just fine with going along with the malice. I think that there are also cultures where, as you were saying, there just hasn't really been serious reflection on this at any stage, and it's just kind of happened, insofar as anything really kind of happens when humans are at the helm. And I think that there are probably also cultures where there was an introduction of this or that bad cultural phenomenon that was originally malicious, but has just sort of drifted into something that's excusable, doesn't feel like the right phrase, but less culpable, put it that way. That almost everything happens, basically. Every kind of moral change can happen in a society in the same way that it can happen in a person. And knowing which one we're addressing does actually have relevance to how we need to address it.
Yeah, to your point, I would say that in a lot of circumstances, even on the outside, it might match some of the sins that we're going to see here in an eighth circle. It lacks the malice. And I actually think in a lot of ways, what we're seeing is actually the fruits of acedia. Because I actually think that's probably, if I had to name a sin that I actually think is absolutely ubiquitous in every aspect of our culture, I think it's slothfulness. It's a cooling of love. And that's where you get into those scenarios where you wake up one day and say, how did I get here? And so but acedia and malice are very distinct from one another, because the cooling of love is very different than like the intentional act. And so I would say a lot of cases, what we're actually dealing with are the fruits of acedia. That's a good question. So notice too, just to push us along a bit, on line 90, Dante the Pilgrim also rants against this sin. So you have one from the poet, and then you have another rant about it from Dante the Pilgrim, right? So it's just a 1-2 punch on this, right? Dante does not like this sin. And then we get into this like fascinating reference, which I don't know if everyone's familiar with, about the donation of Constantine. So maybe this is kind of a fun story. So maybe we should just parse this out real fast. So my understanding of this is basically like when Emperor Constantine, Roman Empire, etc., when he's like, hey, I'm moving the capital of the Roman Empire to Byzantium, right? We're going to the east. I need someone to control things here in the west. So I'm going to give you this temporal power over Italy to the Pope. And so this was actually believed to be like a historical thing that had happened in Dante's age. This was an actual explicit thing. And so most people agree today that that's a forgery. That's not something that actually happened. It's interesting. Ethlin in his commentary pushes against this just a little bit and says there was the temporal government at that time was becoming really corrupt and useless. And so you do actually see the empire leaning more into the Catholic bishops of that time to take on certain roles and structures and build a certain infrastructure, like a certain societal infrastructure. But there's no donation. But again, what you see here is Dante railing against the papacy having a temporal power, and that the papacy should not have this temporal power. It should not be ruling over Italy. We should be under the empire, and the papacy has the spiritual authority. It has this higher authority that it should be focused on. And if it was more focused on that, things would be better.
The Pope should not be a bishop on a chessboard. That's for kings and queens.
He's upset with Constantine because he thinks that the temporal power should be located in Rome because Rome is a special place. Dante really likes the centrality of Rome, the Pax Romana. Like he sees something special about the city and the overlay of those two features, spiritual and temporal, geographically in one location. So I think that he's really upset that this happened.
Well, a lot of people were quite fascinated with. I mean, the fact that romance, in the sense of adventure, that the word came to mean that is not an accident.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you look not only at the Byzantines, not only at Moscow's whole thing about being the third Rome, which I won't start.
Moscow, Idaho, or
yes,
That's a good distinction.
One of the things that I found kind of fascinating about the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople is like there were multiple Islamic states that referred to themselves as of Rome. The power of Rome as an idea, and the concept of rule by law rather than arbitrary whim was an enchanting one, not just to Western European Catholics, but to like the whole para-Mediterranean civilization.
It's incredible.
Yeah, no, very good. All right, let's push on. Canto 20. So we're gonna make it to the fourth ditch. And here we have, who do we have here? We have sorcerers, fortune tellers. Like, I think this is actually probably one of the most grotesque contrapassos. And he describes it. I mean, he describes it with a certain grotesque nature, right? He gives way more detail than he needs to here. So I mean, in short, right? The souls are walking, but their heads have been twisted backwards.
Mm-hmm.
And so he gives this like very detailed account that they're weeping, they're crying, and their tears are going down their back and basically on their butt cheeks. He gives this like kind of like grotesque, vulgar description. And it really, go ahead.
It's body horror.
Yeah, it kind of is. Yeah. Into the cleft where the buttocks separate.
Yeah. Like he's very detailed on this.
I do find this less grotesque than Saw. Like I prefer it when the medievals do it.
That's a good distinction. The and what's interesting too here is the heads being twisted. Like it's not I took that not just simply that the heads are on backwards, but the heads have been actually like twisted around, right? It's a very grotesque scene. Because the other thing that's interesting here is that none of them can speak, or at least none of them can speak or do speak, I should say.
Such a twisting may have happened in a fit of palsy sometime, but not to my eye, So it's like when people have right. They're like wrenched around backwards.
But obviously the contrapasso here, right, is clear. So these are sorcerers. They thought they could tell the future. They thought they could see these things. It's interesting that Dante views all these characters as malicious, right? That they kind of understood what they were doing. You get some somewhat famous sorcerers and seers and prophets in here as well. But the contrapasso is pretty clear, right? That are now for all eternity, they see backwards. They can't even see what's right in front of them, right? They could stumble on something right in front of them, even though through the whole life they claim to be able to see the future.
And we don't even have to guess at something very obvious, because he says, "He who wished to see too far ahead parades backward and looks behind him in damnation." So he's spelling it right out for us.
I will say I was a little sad that Tiresias was here. I really liked Tiresias. We've had him before. We saw him, on the podcast. We worked through the Odyssey. We saw him down there. The Theban prophet. He pops up in the Bacchae. He's kind of an interesting character. So I was a little sad to see him here. What's funny to me though, and I don't please parse this out for me. It's funny to me that Dante mentions this one story about him here. I'm not entirely sure why this story is connected. But Tiresias, if you don't know the story, it's a hilarious story that he mentions, right? So Tiresias is famous for being a woman for a certain period of time. So Tiresias is out. He sees these snakes coupling. He messes with them, and he's turned into a woman. And then he lives his life as a woman for a certain period of time. And then he sees two snakes coupling again. He messes with them, and he's turned back into a man. And it's a famous narrative. And I don't think I can't remember if Dante gives the whole thing here. It's a famous narrative here because Zeus and Hera get into an argument about which gender, which sex derives more pleasure from sex. And they get into an argument about it, and they don't know who they can ask about it. And then they remember Tiresias has been both a man and a woman. And so then they go to Tiresias, and they're like, hey, what do you think? And Tiresias says, Tiresias tells them, oh yeah, it's by far women, like 9 times more. Women totally get more pleasure out of sex. And so this is why Tiresias becomes blind. So Hera, in a rage, blinds Tiresias. And Zeus is like, oh, I feel kind of bad. And so he gives him the gift of unerring prophecy. And this is how Tiresias becomes. So I guess I just answered my own question. So I guess that's why he mentions the snakes, because it's the story of how he became a seer, maybe. So anyway, it's a funny narrative, but it was
weird.
Say again.
For anyone who isn't familiar with Greek mythology, they're all this weird. It's not you.
That was a fun story. So, but I guess maybe I answered my own question. So the reason that narrative is mentioned is simply because that is the origin of him actually becoming, this kind of unerring Theban prophet.
But where's the example of him being calculating and malicious in this prophetic act?
Well, I wonder if Dante takes all these prophets and seers to be false.
That's kind of what you'd have. I mean, right, if you're deceived and really think you're reading palms or whatever, I mean, I don't know. Like,
I'd be more inclined to look at it through the lens of the Witch of Endor. That, like, in one sense, calling her a false prophet would be very misleading because she really brought Samuel up. But, like, this is not the kind of thing that the Lord our God wants us to be involved with. Whether it's summoning the spirits of the dead or summoning other kinds of spirits. Just get a job, stay away from her.
But then how does it fit with our calculating fraud?
That I'm less sure.
Mm-hmm. I think one of my favorite reads, because we've talked about the Witch of Endor and Saul going to her to call up the soul of Samuel in the Old Testament. One of my favorite reads of that is that, yeah, she's a fraud, and then she's actually shocked that Samuel shows up. Right. So like it actually works, and she's like terribly surprised about what's happening. Yeah, I think in that example, I think the way Dante reads this is that all of these people were intentionally deceivers, right? The bird sign, I'm reading the bird signs. I'm trying to tell you what's going on, because obviously there's no actual, the Greek gods, there's none of these things. And so they're all malicious because they're all deceivers. That's a good question.
He doesn't mention a particular, I mean, in some cases, like with Odysseus, he's latching onto a particular story, and that's why you're locked into this. But he doesn't mention a particular offense that Tiresias.
No, he just gives the story of how he got his manly quills again.
Come to think of it, you mentioned the Bacchae earlier, and this is sort of unusual at any rate in the Greek literature that I'm familiar with. But Euripides was something of an iconoclast by temperament. He's the one who wrote the Bacchae. And Tiresias doesn't cut a particularly good figure in it. I mean, no one does. It's a play by Euripides. But specifically, Tiresias comes across in that play as a very sort of like a wishy-washy religious figure who wants to weasel through things on technicalities is the best way I can think of to describe him. I wonder if he might have been drawing on that as well for this.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point. I agree with you 100%. The Bacchae is it's one of my favorite plays, probably one of the most unsettling pieces of literature in Greek mythology. But our Greek plays. I actually really like it just because how it dovetails into Plato's Symposium. So on the podcast, we actually have 2 episodes coming up on the Bacchae, and we kind of work through it. And we work through it as an antecedent to Plato's Symposium of understanding eros and erotic desire. So, but you're absolutely correct. It's a weird play for Tiresias, because Tiresias is typically like the Gandalf figure. Like he just kind of shows up and tells everyone, right? And it's like when Samuel shows up or the prophet Nathan, like he's just gonna show up and tell everyone how you got everything wrong, right? Where is it? Tiresias also shows up in Antigone,
Okay.
right? He shows up and tells King Creon, like, you're an idiot. You need to be going and doing these things, right? So you are correct that in the Bacchae, he's very different. I wonder, though, that gets into a question of like how much Dante actually knows about Greek literature, because he doesn't even have Homer. So I took it just broadly speaking, that he finds all of these characters, these kind of like pagan prophets, to be frauds, to be maliciously deceiving people. Now, what's really funny is that then he gives at the end of this canto this like really long thing about Virgil's hometown and how it's named after a witch, and like it's one of those things that particularly it's the first time reader, you're like, what are we doing here? Like, why is he doing this? And I think it was interesting because I had to dive into this section to try and figure out. But one of the theories here, and Estlin kind of leans into this, is that there was also a theory that Virgil was some type of prophet or magician or some type of pagan seer. And this is for two reasons. It's actually for reasons we've already talked on the podcast. But if you remember, Virgil wrote Eclogue 4 before the birth of Christ, and obviously he's not talking about Christ. But the way it reads, there's going to be this child and this golden age that comes in and etc. It very much then was received by many of the early church fathers as a inadvertent pagan prophecy about the coming of Jesus Christ. And so there was this way that Virgil then started to be seen as like a prophet. I think on the podcast we talked about him being almost like a secular John the Baptist, because he's between these two ages, right? He's also between, you mentioned earlier, like the imperial Rome and the apostolic Rome, right? If you see that as a prophecy of Christ, he stands in between these. So one of the theories here is why there's this long diatribe at the end about Virgil's hometown, and he's like going off about the fact that he doesn't like this witch or whatever, is it's also kind of purifying Virgil's own perception that he's like, no, I hate this sin. I would never engage right in this. And it's Dante kind of purifying him of this certain negative connotation that's attached to Virgil.
Which, I mean, the connotation of Virgil being a sort of white magician is very strong. It's actually why we spell Virgil the way we do in English, because in Latin it's V-E-R, but the standard English spelling is V-I-R, because the Latin word for wand is virga.
There you go.
Yeah, I was not familiar with this. I mean, not to push into it too far, but like, I didn't realize that the Romans, after a certain point, would like treat the Aeneid like a magical text, like almost like certain people treat the Bible today, where they'd be like, what should I do with my life? It's like, I know, I'll just flip open the Aeneid and stop it and read then what's going on here. And that's what the gods are trying to tell me. Like, we see, like, this is how people sometimes approach scripture, which we all make fun of this. And then that's basically what St. Augustine did in the Confessions. But setting that aside, right? Like, this is a terrible way to approach this. But apparently, like, Virgil's Aeneid gained that type of like almost religious fervor and like superstition within Rome. And so Virgil took on these negative, I should make a distinction, these negative connotations, because I think him as a inadvertent prophet of our Lord Jesus Christ is not what's being condemned here. Because obviously the Holy Spirit can work through people to prophesy even when they don't understand it. And so like one of the examples we gave was Psalm 22. I'm going by memory here, but Psalm 22, which opens up, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so when Christ yelled that from the cross, this psalm would have come to mind. And if you read the psalm, it sounds very much what Christ would have been thinking on the cross. Obviously, David the psalmist, is writing it about his current plight, but he says things like, my bones are not broken. They gamble for my clothing. He has all these like very key statements. I think he even says like my hands and feet are pierced or something like that. So he has all these like very key statements. Is David or the psalmist aware that he's prophesying about what Christ will think on the cross? Probably not. Can the Holy Spirit do that inadvertently through him? Yes. So then the theory here is that the Holy Spirit did this inadvertently through a pagan. And so that, however, I think is kind of a pristine Catholic tradition that the early church fathers engaged in. Then to the side of that, you have Virgil in that kind of context gaining this reputation for being superstitious, a magician, the Aeneid having this kind of magical properties, etc. And I think that's what he's pushing out against at the end of this canto.
I imagine it would have been a fairly common self-defense for people who did like to dabble in the black arts. That, well, Virgil did it, and blah blah blah. Like, it's not a good defense, but it's the kind of thing that people reach for. Reach being the operative word.
Yeah, no, very good. Anything else in Canto 20?
Get a little orientation of where we're heading at the very, very end, where the hemispheres don't turn. Going to get down to Cain eventually, kind of almost hurrying along. Like, well, we got a long way to go, so let's push on. So that's kind of fun. I love the topography of the entire Inferno. Like, I just love the broken rocks and the gates and how they're stumbling and the weightlessness of one and the heaviness of the other and the physicality of hell. I love the whole time. So.
I love Jesus.
Well, that's good too.
That's a good value add. One of the things too, sometimes it's dangerous to ask open-ended questions, but obviously Virgil seems to have a knowledge that is disproportionate to him. So for instance, sometimes Virgil can tell what Dante the Pilgrim is thinking, and he'll answer Dante's question without Dante having to ask. And that's really interesting how Virgil can do that. The other one is Dante keeps telling us what's happening in the sky, but he can't see it. Like, they can't see the moon where they're at. And so that's an interesting point, is how does Virgil seems to be aware of the constellations, where the moon is, etc. He can tell Dante what time it is, right? So as Dante receives this, if memory serves, I think they're now into, I think we've gone past midnight, right? So now they're into Holy Saturday, the beginning of Holy Saturday. And so one way, though, is like how Virgil can tell this, because he can't see the sky. And so there's some questions here about Virgil's knowledge as a guide and what's been given to him to kind of help him in this. And so it's a topic I'd like to think of more. Maybe one of you can unpack it for me, but it's something I'd like to think about more.
Right after the paragraph where we're saying he's not, into which things, and it's like, the moon just went past that I can't see.
Well, of course, one of the first things that we get in the comedy, and that is very much reinforced when we're about to enter the city of Dis proper that we're now in, is that Virgil is not just on a mission from Beatrice, but has been specifically given authority that he does not natively possess. Like, he has the ability to call on an angel to command the gates of Dis to be opened, that Virgil by himself could not have done.
Mm-hmm.
So I would assume that this would be another aspect of that. I mean, that's even how Virgil gets into purgatory, I assume, because he doesn't get to stay. Spoilers.
Yeah. That actually was one of the most fascinating things when I first read the comedy, was that the guide through purgatory is a unbaptized pagan. But we don't have to get there. We just have to talk about the Inferno. So any other thoughts on Canto 20? All right, hearing none, let's push into Canto 21. So we're still in the 8th circle, punishing simple fraud, but now we are in the 5th ditch, the grafters. This is an interesting, this is actually a really interesting kind of section, little pericope that we get into here. Mm-hmm. So let me kind of maybe set a little bit of the stage here. So the grafters, like, what is the sin? So my understanding of the sin is that we just had simony, right? Mm-hmm. And they're selling all these church offices and things of this nature, at least like in a narrow definition. And now we have basically the temporal power version of this, right? So these are people that are taking bribes and et cetera, part of the civil power, right? So they're selling, civil offices or taking bribes to, exert their authority in certain ways or et cetera. So this is a corruption then of the temporal. And what's fascinating here is that we get this and I'll be honest with you, I did not like this section at all the first time I read the comedy. I did not like it at all, because I like this kind of, I don't know, I like this kind of dark, gritty Inferno. I like that. It's like making me think about sin and etc. And then I get these goofy demons, like demon band of goofy. Even I struggle. Like, the first time I read this, I was like, "What is this?" I don't know. Because I don't know.
Change of tone.
Yeah,
there's a change of tone. I don't know. Noah, if you like this section, then tell us about it.
Oh, I mean, I'm just a sucker for comic relief. Maybe. I mean, the names are really funny. They're like the Three Stooges or something. They're getting tricked, and they're the is it this canto that ends? Yeah, he made a trumpet of his ass. A lewd trumpet of his ass. Like it's just like too much. And then you get more. I think interplay between Dante and Virgil. Like it's a little bit more expressive than we've seen. So there's like, I don't think we should trust these guys. Virgil's like, we got this. Like, of course, that doesn't work out in the end. So and I think.
Well, it doesn't. It doesn't. I mean, I think the demon's lie doesn't ultimately work.
They make it
because they get away.
Yeah. But I think maybe for the same reason that you like the deep, heavy, Inferno, gritty moral theology, like I'm ready for a break at this point.
That's good. What about the contrapasso?
I don't get this one's contrapasso. I mean, I guess there's the idea, which I think I'm taking from Sayers, of like being sunk in tar or pitch or whatever it is, being sort of along the lines of having sticky fingers. But I mean, that would just be sort of any kind of theft or corruption, not specifically barratry, I think is the word I've usually seen. Because again, clear. So yeah, I don't know.
I did look at, because grift is now a common word on Twitter or X, that I did look up, is graft the same as grift? And obviously there's the extra meanings of grafting apple trees or whatever. Besides that, basically they're the same and have a common origin. Grift appeared around 1902 or something, and it was mostly graft before then.
Grafting pitch onto simony, right?
No. So we think about grifters, I mean, the Doge comes to mind, who's like exposing grifters, like right and left, of people that just like, I'm taking money to give Libyans tax advice, or what I like $17 million. Like that's true grift. Like like you don't need $17 million to give Libyans tax advice, and that is not something that we belong doing. So I think exposing some of that comes to mind right now, but.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you too. The contrapasso on this one, I struggle with to a certain degree to understand exactly. Like, there's a tar. I mean, he kind of gives some examples. I mean, Dante is obviously an excellent teacher, so if I'm not tracking with something, the fault is very much with me. But he gives he gives these examples, right? So he talks about the tar, boiling and things like this. He talks about also like it's like the little boys, like the little sous chefs. Assistants that help the cook, and so they take their little forks and they keep pushing, right? They keep pushing the vegetables back into the stew, right? They push the meat back into the stew, and that's what the demons are doing. Is they're taking their pitchforks and they're shoving the souls back in the tar. And this is another one that we see in which there's like a punishment, a contrapasso, and then there's some type of creature that seems to be enforcing whether or not you're engaging in it. To the right level. So remember, the centaurs were shooting the violent if they, got into a different area they weren't supposed to in the river of, boiling blood, etc. So I don't know. I mean, you kind of think there's somewhat of that pocketing aspect again, right? There is a little bit of that stickiness that he could be playing off of. There's the demons themselves. They seem to have to be tethered to this somehow, to this kind of comical band of demons that really can't get anything done and are fighting amongst themselves and being incompetent. I mean, if again, this is a ditch that has to deal with grafters basically in the government, in the temporal, and here you have these demons that are so incompetent and chaotic they can't get anything done. So like, is Dante using them as an analog for something? So even because he hates this type of corruption, so them showing them as like fools I think would work well. The bugle scene is just beyond the pale. And so, what's he doing here? I mean, it is, I don't know. It's a fascinating canto. It's what I struggled with when I first read it. The only reason I don't struggle with it now is because I know it's coming.
Forewarned is forearmed. I have read that the names of the devils are puns on the names of Florentine officials who either had themselves been guilty of barratry or who had been involved in the trumped up charges that got Dante banished. However, I've just read that that is the case. I've never read particular explanations about any of the specific names.
Yeah, I think Estlin talks about that too, that this could be a play. So these could be little kind of grotesque caricatures of politicians, if you will.
I have also read, I think Sayers makes this point, and I'm pretty sure Williams does too, that the circles of fraud are very appropriately the place where we begin to see actual demons. Because hitherto, we've seen malevolent figures, but they've always been either human souls or mythological creatures, which could maybe be read as, okay, this is some type of demon, but it doesn't hit the same way. Like, these are fallen angels. These are specifically perverted intellect. And so it doesn't necessarily follow that they would have to come in specifically to do with like secular corruption. But it is very fitting that they come in this broader circle, whether it's specifically in this ditch of it or not. And I do think also that there is value, and it is very medieval too, in the fact that the devils are ridiculous. Because there's a certain strain, and strain is very definitely the word, in some forms of Catholic thinking that is just way too focused on hell and Satan, and like, I won't name names, but there's a certain kind of spirituality, if that's even the right word for it, that is just very focused on hating evil and being afraid of it in a way that I think is profoundly unhealthy. Because I mean, that's very literally and specifically not the point. I mean, loving God, which is the opposite, is the point. And that's simply not the same thing as hating evil. That's not how love and hatred and good and evil work. And I think that one of the strengths of medieval spirituality and culture was the fact that the devil, although he was correctly perceived as evil, was also, I would say correctly, perceived as an idiot. Like, he's fundamentally wrong about what he has devoted his entire being to. Like, this is not just a bad choice. This is an incorrect choice. And he and every spirit like him don't have the right to be solemn all the time. Like, they don't get that respect.
Yeah. No, I think that plays out. Yeah, you agree, or I agree with like if you look at a lot of medieval art, like the way that demons are shown, sometimes are like these little comical, distorted figures.
Medievals love little guys.
Yeah, right. Like it's not how we would show them today. You know, the other thing too that I think is unique about this particular canto is that we see basically all the different actors in this engaging in the sin or something like the sin. So, for instance, when we were on Wrath, we saw that the boatman was wrathful. We saw the souls being punished were wrathful. We saw that Virgil became angry because he couldn't go through the city of Dis, and we saw the angel had a righteous anger when he came down. It seemed to be very perturbed about the entire ordeal of being sent down because of how recalcitrant all these demons are. There's something similar going on here. So we're in fraud. We're in simple fraud. We're in these kind of grafters. And what are we going to see here? Well, we see the demons, and they're going to make a deal with Virgil and Pilgrim and Dante the Pilgrim. And obviously, we're literally in the ditch that deals with fraud, and we have a deal being struck. So, like, all of our alarm bells. Yeah. So, like, you know, our deep esoteric read here is that this might be bad. And you know, it's interesting though. What's interesting here, I think Noah pointed this to it. It's actually Dante the Pilgrim that seems to be more like aware that this is a bad idea than Virgil is. And that's a role reversal. And I wonder too there if that's because now we're dealing with demons and the Christian understands like, nope, they're just disordered. This stay away. Nothing good comes from this. And the pagan is like, yeah, we can totally trust these guys. Like this is going to be fine. Because that's a role reversal that I think we have to think about. And then clearly, obviously, then I think you see too, Virgil's prudence kicks in, and leads Dante the Pilgrim, to safety. And is that a counter to fraud? Right, a rightly ordered prudence is as a contrary to simple fraud.
I can't remember the source of it. It's either Williams or Sayers, but someone said of this passage and of the fact that ultimately Virgil is going to be lightly embarrassed by one of the hypocrites who, points out the whole situation that you trusted a demon, really? But the description of the sort of Virgil's misstep here is that humanism by itself, like humanism unleavened by Christian faith, is always apt to underestimate and be baffled by the deliberate will to evil.
I like that. I like that a lot. Because it is
things throughout the Inferno is the role of danger. On the one hand, they face absolutely impossible dangers, and Virgil's like, God wants this to happen, get out of our way or help us or whatever. And then on the other hand, you're like, gosh, like, are they going to make it? Like, there's, you really wonder, like, are we about to go off a ledge here? And are these demons going to catch them? And it seems like Virgil in some cases is totally confident. Other cases he's sweating it. Like, this could be the end of our journey. Like, buckle up, Dante. So I think there's like a weird, like either they have supernatural confidence or in some, you wonder as a reader, like, which one are we supposed to believe here? Could they get caught? Or are they kind of invincible like Mario when he's flashing,
That's a great analog. That's wonderful. So far on the podcast, I don't think anyone has given a Dante the Pilgrim to Mario analogy. So that's good. No, we appreciate you're here, Noah. The
Wii game.
Can we talk about the deal that was made? So just what's the problem? The problem is that these little, I don't know what you want to call them, bridges that go between the ditches, right? The bridge is broken. If memory serves, it's broken actually because of the harrowing of hell. It's been broken since then, right? When Christ our Lord went down into hell. So of course, then they make this deal. We all know this is not going to be good. So look at Canto 22. I think the other reason I don't like this section when I was a first time reader is like, what was it? The first canto we had, Canto 18. Those are both fascinating cantos, or both a fascinating canto that we get 2 ditches in one canto with 3 different types of sins, and they're all fascinating. And he goes so fast, and then this bumbling band of demons gets like multiple cantos on this deal, right? So like Canto 22, it's the 8th circle, the 5th ditch continued. What I found most fascinating here, obviously, is that they catch a sinner, right? So they catch one of the sinners, and they pull him out, and they're going to tear him apart, right? This is the problem. If you don't get, and so what's so fascinating about this is that we see a sinner engaging in the sin that put them in hell. And so he is fraudulent with the demons, right? So it's like, okay, yeah, just back off me a bit and I'll tell you guys more about, Florence and who's down here and X, Y, and Z. And what they do, they back off and he hops back into, the tar before they can get him. And then the demons crash into each other and make a big, bloody mess about the whole thing. And again, it's this comedic scene, but it's another character then that's engaging in that type of sin.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know. It's a fascinating aspect.
Mm-hmm. Come to think of it, it is a slight foreshadowing, arguably, of what will happen to. I've forgotten his name, but the fellow with the ice on his face down in Cocytus. That's in Fraud Complex, though. Just a bit of adumbration.
How's it a foreshadowing to him?
A certain character says, well, I'll if you tell me your story, I'll pull the ice off your face, and if I don't, may I go down to the center of the ice?
Oh yeah, I remember now. Yeah, that's interesting.
That bit's hard to read.
Yeah, well, Dante's not through his whole formation, so. But I mean, in this canto though, Canto 22, I don't know if anyone has anything else to add to it. Maybe I'm not giving enough time and attention to this section, but I really think the most fascinating part of this entire canto is just simply that we see a sinner engaging in that. I've seen commentaries say that like this is the first time we see in the entire Inferno a sinner engaging in the sin that put them there. I'm not entirely sure I buy that, because obviously like the wrathful are being wrathful, right? I mean, they're
Gluttony is gluttoning.
yeah,
Like
gluttony.
eating mud, they're eating. Yeah, that interpretation doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I read that and I was like, that doesn't make sense. Also, even Francisca, right? Like she, like obviously, like not lust, but like she's bringing, like, yeah. Well, one, they're coupled together, but two, she's still seducing, right? She seduces Dante in that. So like it's interesting because like I agree that like there's a certain intentionality here on the sin that's really interesting. It's a sin perpetrated against another, which is really fascinating. But you also kind of see that with the wrathful to a certain degree. So, but again, just like with the other cantos, all the parties currently are participating in this sin in some way, even if it's like in a contrary way. They're all, Dante's using these as little pedagogical characters to try and teach us something about this sin.
To think of it, I guess one of the lessons, and this would probably apply to the adumbrated one as well. One of the lessons is probably don't make deals with evil in the first place. But also, too, if you made a deal with evil, don't keep it. That's not a deal.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Because I do think that that's something that a lot of us are prone to in, especially earlier in the moral life. That, well, okay, I'll make such and such compromise. No, you're not bound to that. You don't have to compromise because you said you would.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, let's look at Canto 23 then. The 8th circle, we're escaping from the 5th ditch and going into the 6th ditch. So, I think that, so I think, how does Virgil, who again, Virgil's representing human wisdom, how does he kind of outsmart fraud, or kind of finally dawns on him? So again, I think that you can see then that Virgil finally understands kind of what's happening. And so then that human wisdom, that human prudence can finally kind of take Dante the Pilgrim where he needs to go. Again, it's just a fascinating scene because Dante the Pilgrim was the one that was more sensitive to this than Virgil was. So then they're able to escape, and they go down into the 6th ditch, and they see what is like a very clear contrapasso. So they see these souls, and they're walking, and they have these beautiful golden cloaks on the outside. But on the inside, they're heavy with lead. And so they have this crushing weight that these people have to walk on. And these are the hypocrites. And I think probably one of the most memorable scenes here, as they're kind of chit-chatting with the hypocrites, is they come upon an individual crucified to the ground. And so then, obviously, if that wasn't horrific enough, right, then these souls that are wearing these large, heavy cloaks are then kind of tromping on this particular soul. And this really stands out to me because, correct me if I'm wrong, memory might not be serving, but it's interesting that we have like one sinner in a certain section that's pulled out for like a particular punishment that's distinct from all the other souls in that particular section. It doesn't occur to me that we have a lot of examples of that.
We have at least 3 more, but we won't meet them until the center of hell.
Sower of Discord? Is he? No?
Brutus, Cassius, and Judas.
Certainly those, yeah.
Yeah,
those 3 and Judas, and I suppose Satan. Well, no, Satan has the same punishment as the rest of Cocytus. But yeah, those 3 and Satan, or those 3 and Caiaphas, I think are the only ones that I can think of that have a unique punishment within a circle.
Yeah, it just doesn't seem that anyone that we've seen so far has this type of uniquely called out. And maybe, obviously, if I had to give a reason, Caiaphas, right? So this individual who is crucified to the ground, this is Caiaphas. This is the high priest. His hypocrisy has to deal particularly with our Lord, and also with our Lord's death. And so obviously you would think that there might be a certain weight, to use that word, that's then given to his particular hypocrisy. And so Caiaphas has to have one of the most ironic lines in all of sacred scripture.
It is expedient that one should die for the people.
Yeah. That it's better that one man die than the whole people. And so he's talking about why we need to crucify Christ.
John said it. He died being high priest that year.
Yeah, John uses it with a deep saturation of irony, that he says this, and it's actually going to be true, right? Because Christ was going to die on behalf of the people, but that is not how Caiaphas actually means it. And so now he finds himself, crucified to the ground.
Speaking of unconscious prophets, as we were earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's a good connection. What's really interesting is that Virgil, looking on this scene, is astonished. Did you see this? It's around 124.
Yes.
I'm not sure what that... So again, like when we track that Virgil has a particular reaction to something, it's typically because he's being used as, this icon, this analogy for human wisdom, a natural human wisdom without the gift of grace. And we see too that at certain times Virgil doesn't have a full understanding of our Lord, and so certain things confuse him. So I didn't know if that's what was happening here. He's astonished because here he has this hypocrite, but he doesn't quite understand the totality of Christ, and so he can't quite grasp why this sinner would suffer such a punishment, because he can't, Virgil doesn't quite understand the whole situation. I was trying to figure out how to contextualize his astonishment.
It's very brief astonishment. Then he goes on to ask for directions.
I guess it's legitimate to ask exactly how much it is that Virgil knows. Because, of course, he is a spirit in limbo, and limbo, it's not a place of punishment, certainly not in Dante, but it's not a place of enlightenment either. And so how much more does Virgil know now than he just knew already as a righteous pagan? Obviously enough to recognize what Beatrice is, and he understands now that there is one God, and on some level that it is the God of the Jews and Christians. But it might well be that he didn't have full details on how exactly the whole cross thing went down. I mean, he died before Jesus was even born, so
he's aware of the harrowing event, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a question then of like, to what degree does he actually understand these things? And really, it seems like his understanding of God and of Christ particularly, is kind of limited to what he observed during the harrowing of hell, and then what he kind of somewhat ascertained when Beatrice came and spoke to him. But he still doesn't quite get it, right? Even when Beatrice comes and speaks to him, he doesn't understand why Beatrice isn't afraid. Like, why is Beatrice not afraid to be here? She has to give, this place can't touch me. I'm one of the righteous. We're only afraid of things that can actually hurt us. So he doesn't, I think that, again, one way to read that is like Virgil does really well until human reason starts to come to its edge. And so he doesn't quite get it. And so anyway, I just wanted to point out that he was astonished just because we are tracking a lot of how Virgil interacts with things. Any other thoughts here on the hypocrites?
One of them, I hadn't thought of this before, even though the passage came up, but there is something fitting in one of the hypocrites. Like, the last thing they hear from one of the hypocrites is a sort of light mockery for, and a statement of theological truth. When I was at Bologna, I heard tell of all the devil's vices, and I heard he was a liar and the father of lies. Like, there's something incredibly satisfying in that being how the religious hypocrite signs off.
I like that.
Like that.
Mm-hmm. It's not expressly hypocritical, but it's the right mood.
Yeah, and it's the neither truth nor falsehood of it, because like it's coming from a source that is profoundly false, and at the same time is correct.
It's not really sympathetic with Virgil for having been taken in. Just kind of sanctimonious.
That is a very good word for it.
I think too, just as a broader note, is Dante's ease at putting clerics in hell. And so obviously the hypocrites, I think, are predominantly, if not fully, all clerics. Obviously in simony we had that. But even with like gluttony, and then with where was it? Yes, with avarice, right? That's where he actually sees, he's like, how many of them are actually clerics? Because he can tell their haircut. And so, no, I think it's one thing that Dante is raging against too, is just simply the corruption in the church, and he doesn't seem to pull any punches. Well, this is the same Dante who the first person he recognizes in hell as a canonized saint. So Dante the poet is, he has some things to teach us. All right, let's look at Canto 24, the 8th circle, the 7th ditch in the 8th circle. This is theft. I have to say, this probably the first time I read the Inferno was probably one of the most intriguing passages in the entire thing, because you're like, wait, what is happening right now? And trying to figure out the contrapasso is really fascinating. So, on a broad level, right? Who do we see here? It's punished in the 7th ditch. We get thieves, right? We get theft, and this section is somewhat famous because the contrapasso, at least initially, right, when we first see it, and this is around line 82 or so, it's snakes. And you're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. They're thieves and the snake, and they're hidden and they get bit. And like, yeah, there's some parallels there. I can see how this works. But the guy that in Canto 24, he, let's see, I think this is the one where he gets bit and then just burns up. So that's like line 98 or so. He gets bit, and I think he gets compared to a phoenix, correct? Mm-hmm. Yes. And he kind of burns up. And you're like, okay, well, that's kind of fascinating that occurred. I also thought it was interesting that the soul at 133, because we're always kind of looking to see how is this sin becoming like thematic throughout the text. I thought it was interesting at the soul on 133 says, it pains me that you've caught me here, right? So these are thieves. So he's like been caught. Mm-hmm. So Dante's using this language. And this is a thief that I believe stole vestments from the sacristy is what he did. What did you take of one section that I appreciate here that I didn't mention was Dante's kind of like exhortation to glory. I mean, it's in the mouth of Virgil. This is at line like 46 or so. He says, you must shake off your sluggishness, the teacher said, for no one comes to fame who sits in soft pillows of down or lies at ease in bed. And when his life is wasted utterly, he leaves such traces of himself behind as smoke and air or foam upon the sea. Get up, then, conquer your distress with that brave soul that wins through every fight, unless it should turn weak beneath the flesh's weight. It won't suffice for you to leave the damned, for you shall have to climb a longer stair. Turn that to profit if you understand. So it's really, again, we get this fascinating thing where the Christian who's lost his way is coached by the pagan. And here, I think it's somewhat fitting that the pagan understands like the thumatic side. He understands being spirited. He understands that you have to get up and you have to fight for glory. And you can kind of take the longer stair is typically understood as purgatory, right? So you think this little climbing out of the ditch is difficult. You're going to have to climb all the way up the mountain of purgatory to be purged of your sins. So anyway, I don't know. I like this. Virgil, like, get off your soft pillows. You got to make something of yourself. You have a long journey. Let's get this done.
Goes back to your acedia comment, that you've got to fight sloth. This is another sin to watch that. We haven't come across a circle of acedia, right?
We don't.
Well, it depends on how you read it. So that's a big question. Is acedia somewhere in the Inferno? So there's a couple ways to answer that. One is no, it's not. Two is that Dante the Pilgrim is the example of acedia, right? So he is the example of slothfulness because the entire first canto, he's lost midway in his life. He doesn't know how he got here. He doesn't know how he lost the path of truth. His love has cooled. And so he is the example of this kind of slothfulness. But then a lot of people will point to the very small passage in the circle that deals with the wrathful, that there seems to be a second category of soul in the wrathful, which are the ones that aren't moving, that are underneath the waves and are just sitting there bubbling. And so a lot of people read that as slothfulness or acedia because it's on the contrary side of wrath, right? So wrath is I had too much zeal, right? I could not control my zeal. And acedia is a lack of zeal. And so a lot of people will put those souls that are bubbling underneath the surface as acedia.
I love Dante's response to the passage you just read, which is to fake till you make it. I stood up and said, with greater show of breath than what I really felt within, I am strong and resolute. Now let us go.
Yeah.
Which,
none of woman born shall harm Macbeth. Wait, no.
Yeah, Dante the Pilgrim is a very human character.
Which I think I can't remember if I'm getting this from Sayers or Lewis, which I don't think Lewis makes much sense because he didn't really write about Dante that I recollect. Anyway, there was a passage that I read in some commentator or other that I really appreciated because I feel sometimes that there's an oddly specific delight in tearing down narrators in some corners of literary criticism. But the point made in this commentary was that anything that we feel like we can or wish to make fun of Dante the Pilgrim for was put there by Dante the poet. He is not completely without self-awareness here.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, and I think at times we actually really struggle with that, if that makes sense. What I mean by that is I don't know, we tend to naturally conflate Dante the poet with Dante the Pilgrim.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really...
We get sucked into the narrative, basically.
Say again?
We get sucked into the narrative, basically.
Yeah, we do get sucked into the narrative. And so it's interesting to me that we struggle then to see Dante as a saint because we read him through Dante the Pilgrim, even though he's the author. I actually think we do something very similar to Boethius. So Boethius puts himself in his own work as and he don't need to be consoled by lay philosophy as he's awaiting his execution. And so he's doubting, right? He's doubting. He has, and so we see Boethius, we see Boethius as he presents himself, and not in the masterful soul that must have been able to write that. And it does some when authors do this, it does something.
Lady philosophy, right?
Right.
It was Boethius.
Right.
But we look at Boethius being pathetic and lame and crying, and wow, right. Boethius sure is lame.
But it only speaks more of their humility, right? That they're able to present themselves in this manner and to expose their own flaws. But then, it really seems to skew with our capacity to see their own spiritual brilliance.
I think part of it is just that when we read a saint talking about, or for that matter, a non-saint talking about, I'm this and I'm that and I'm the other worst thing, that isn't narrative in the same way that this or the Consolation are narratives, because even though they're not fiction the way a novel is fiction, they are fictional stories. And I think because the human mind has such a strong appetite for story and for entering into stories, that there is a level on which we forget that they were written by somebody. And that it is just that simple, that we have to consciously leave the story and think about it from an exterior perspective before we can fully digest a story.
Yeah, I think that's fair. All right, let's look at the next and kind of final canto 25. So it's the 8th circle, still working through simple fraud. We're in the 7th ditch, dealing with thievery.
And Pistoia.
What is that?
And Pistoia.
He's got a couple figs for God.
Yeah, I mean, this starts off with this, a terrible act of blasphemy, which even Dante points back to. One of the things we wrestled with on the podcast was the fact that Dante uses an example of blasphemy against Zeus as his example of blasphemy in the Inferno. And like, why did he do that? That was like something that we wrestled with earlier. So I thought it was really fascinating that here, when we actually get an example of blasphemy against God directly, that Dante makes it explicit about pulling this back to his more natural example of blasphemy earlier in the Inferno. That's at line 14 or so, right? I'd seen no soul so haughty against God, not him who tumbled from the walls of Thebes. And that was the king that we saw earlier that had talked about not needing Zeus and got blasted back when we dealt with blasphemy. So it's an interesting that Dante intentionally couples those two narratives for the reader.
We had the grafter making a deal. This is a thief blaspheming. Like this is not a thief stealing, right? Which I think is kind of interesting. Like, to me, this doesn't fit. Like the amount of anger at God and like unrepentance, like for a thief, like, I mean, they calculated and they were sneaky and they, were inhumane and took away the humanity of others. All that, but I think it's kind of an odd thing for him to be so aggressive against God, this thief in this circle.
I think it does track with something else that we see definitely specifically within the city of Dis. I don't know if it's present, certainly not in the same way in the suburbs of hell. But remember when we first come into the evil city, the first souls that we meet, the first one that we meet is Farinata. And say what you will about Farinata, but he is an impressive figure. And basically that phrase, say what you will about him, but, is why he's in hell. Because that's how pride works. But like there is, like Farinata is a proud man who has something to be proud of. Which again, doesn't keep you out of hell. Just want to emphasize that. But there's a definite dignity in his pride. Like he's much more like Denethor than an orc, to put it in those terms, because I have to.
You can't put it in Mario terms?
No, actually, when my 5th nephew was being born, I spent the whole day being talked down to by my first nephew for being bad at Mario. So, starting from Farinata, you get increasingly squalid depictions of sin as you descend. Like, the dignity that Farinata has is by no means lost when you get down to Capaneus. Like, you're only one circle further in, and like, sure, the 7th circle has 3 rings, so it's further than it was from, say, the 2nd to 3rd circles. But like, Capaneus still has a certain grandeur, for lack of a better word. But like, there's definitely a sharp break in that respect between violence and any level of fraud simple. Like, there's a definite indignity, a grossness in fraud simple that is not really present in any of the earlier circles. Not even gluttony, really. And Vanifucci is he's nasty in a way that is really tracking and continues to track as we go further down, because it gets so much worse than just indignity in the way they're presenting themselves. I mean, once we get to Casitas, we got, again, spoilers, a guy gnawing on another guy's head because he just hates him that much. Like, yeah, we're in hell, and I'm gonna gnaw on your head. Like this level of squalor, psychologically, spiritually squalorous.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's a juxtaposition there too, that thieves, they come in the night, deception is a big deal, etc. And here we see him, standing up, and he's laid bare. if that makes sense. So he's just out here in the open, and he's cursing God. So everything's been dragged out into the light on the condition of his soul and things like that. I agree with you. I mean, I think when we see these sections, we have to take a step back and say, why was this coupled here? Like, why was this here? The thing that I really like too is that Dante's response to this is, from that point on, the snakes were friends to me. So like the punishment of these sinners, Dante realizes the snakes are not, they're safe as far as he's concerned, and they're going to end up punishing these sinners, and that Dante's going to delight in it. I mean, just to kind of jump to what's, I think, probably some of the most imaginative and interesting sections here, we get two sinners that are attacked by the snakes and have kind of very different reactions. We've already had one that was kind of like burnt up.
Right.
But he said a phoenix, so I'm assuming that means that soul comes back, right? Because obviously we don't believe in annihilationism, so that soul is burnt down and then comes back in some way. So that's one thing that's going on here. But then we get a second one. This is at line 50 or so, right? He says, a snake with 6 feet flings itself and clings to one of them. So these are more like serpent dragon creatures, I guess. This one has feet. And
lizards.
Say again?
Lizards. I feel like lizard is a particularly good word because it has a slithering sound to it that even dragon doesn't have.
Well, we saw a dragon earlier. We didn't talk about him, but the centaur has like a little dragon on his shoulder that's like breathing fire at people, which is like kind of a fascinating picture to begin with. So on this first one, the line 50, the snake, grabs into this individual, and they basically fuse together into one kind of just very grotesque, horrific creature. And then the second one, or the third sinner overall, that we see here in 82, this one seems to be where there's a little snake, and he runs up and he basically bites this guy right on the stomach. And then they kind of take a step back from each other, and then the snake transforms into a man, and the man transforms into a snake, which then gives us the perception that all the snakes that are in this pit are actually damned souls themselves. So the contrapasso, I mean, what is going on with this contrapasso, right? So the snakes are apparently people. We've got these like transformations happening, and this is supposed to be punishing thieves. Like, what's going on with the contrapasso?
It goes back to a concept in Roman law. The way Romans treated property, I don't know that it was all property, but like this would be sort of the default assumption with property, I believe, was basically that property was treated as an extension of the person. So this contrapasso is actually one of the more literal ones from that perspective.
So how does that tie into the snakes and the snakes becoming men? And
well, maybe not snakes specifically, but the deformation and mutation of the body, constantly changing. I mean, that aligns with the Roman idea of what theft was.
So you're changing someone else's body, and then in doing
Changing
so,
their person.
you're grabbing their body and turning it into your body because you're grabbing their property and turning it into your property, essentially.
I would hesitate to call this a fully Christianized understanding of property.
Fairly Lockean, though.
True. That being said, I mean, while I don't know that I agree with Dante's specific placement of this ditch, I mean, it does definitely belong in the 8th circle, so there's not that far it's going to move.
I want to remark that Dante could have said, the snakes became men and the men became snakes. He doesn't do that. He gets very specific in the transformational poetry. He goes into every limb and what part it turned into and what part it separated out from, and like he goes to great length to, maybe he's just showing off his poetic abilities, but I appreciate it. I like it. I like his poetic abilities.
Yeah, there seems to be here again like a particular hatred for this sin. right? Something that he really wants to show, something about the depravity of it. I think, one of the things, maybe kind of piggybacking on the comment of, how Romans saw property. That there, one thing is a thief is not making the proper distinction between what's mine and yours. And so this contrapasso denies that at like the most existential level, that even like my own body and your body are mixed, right? Or have the capacity to be switched. And so, the thief takes other things that aren't his, and now so something's actually robbed from the thief himself, right? Like kind of his own humanity or his own integrity as a being is called into question. Particularly if you look at all the snakes, or if you take the thesis that all the snakes are other types of thieves and things like this. So yeah, it's a really imaginative punishment that I think shows that Dante has like a particular hatred for this particular sin and what it really is. Because I don't think a lot of us would, if we talk about just thievery, would come up with something this grotesque to show it has like an existential nature to it that's actually very troubling. I mean, there's something here that I think Dante the teacher is really drawing out for us.
Kind of to Gabriel's point of, is this the right sequencing of the ditches? Dante had a personal vendetta against the Pope, and he had personal experience with corrupt politicians, like very personal. Thieves, like, okay, it's definitely moral depravity. It's definitely calculating. It's definitely fraudulent. Like, did somebody rob him of his stuff one time? Like, is there some sense in which, why does he have a kind of a personal anger towards thieves? I mean, they just steal stuff, right?
I mean, Florence did rob him of literally everything that he owned, including and his family.
Yes.
So
Florence did that, but
that being said, although I might be willing to disagree with Dante intellectually here, I actually would tend to... What's the word I'm looking for? I don't suspect him of simply letting his personal feelings overwhelm his judgment. And there's a particular reason for that. This may have come up before, I don't know. But at one point in the early 14th century, Pope Boniface VIII, Dante's personal anime nemesis, was seized by soldiers of the King of France for writing a bull that the King of France did not care for one bit. And he was delivered after a few days, but he was so harshly treated by the soldiers in the interim, and so shocked by the fact that people would do this to the Pope, that it is generally thought that it contributed to his death a matter of weeks later, I believe. And Dante, who hated Pope Boniface's guts, described this as Christ led captive and crucified in the person of his vicar.
Bold.
Like, the absolute intellectual clarity of Dante's theology is one of the things that I admire most about him, and the reason that it pisses me off when people talk about Dante put his friends in heaven and his enemies in hell. No, he didn't. Read the book. I just that one drives me absolutely up the wall, but not what we're here about. But because of that, like, rigid, determined justice in recognizing what is due to whom and why, I do think that he may have made an intellectual mistake in where he ranked theft relative to other things. If he did, I don't think it was because he wanted to make the mistake. Personally.
I mean, I agree. I think it's a very flat read to say that Dante put his friends in heaven and, his foes in hell. And we've already seen that that's not true, right? It's very dismissive, I think, of trying to, it's very dismissive of trying to actually kind of sidestep, I think, Dante the teacher, that he has anything here, because it just makes it a very shallow read, if that's your take. But we've already seen clearly that, his like friend's dad is here. We saw very much in the seventh circle that people that he admired very closely, his own teacher was
Mhm.
here as well. He doesn't seem to spare those people at all. So no, I think you have got to have a better read than that. Yeah, I was looking real fast
We meet
to
Ghibellines in Purgatory too.
say again.
We meet Ghibellines in Purgatory too. He wasn't above putting his enemies in heaven.
Right. Yeah, I do think as a broader topic, the structure of the 10 ditches is a really fascinating conversation of how are they actually structured, because obviously our thesis is that the closer that you come to the pit of hell, the more severe the sins. And so just like, for instance, like another example, is theft in the right place. This would seem to say that selling of church offices is less of a sin than being bribed as like a civil official.
Mhm.
And that
We were
also
talking-
doesn't seem to sit well, if that makes sense.
One thing that came to my mind about that specifically is that although controversial take, simony is wrong. Although simony is wrong, it doesn't result in invalid sacraments. Like a person who bribes their way into being ordained, and then the people who ordain them perform the sacrament, has been ordained. And mutatis mutandis for every other sale of a sacrament. Whereas I'm not sure that the same thing is true when you're talking about political graft. Like, is it even still justice when it's been bribed out of a judge or whatever? That's the only thing I can think of that makes the placement of those two specifically make sense. But I mean, there's a whole conversation to be had about every one of the 10 ditches in that respect.
Yeah. Very good. Well, any other kind of final thoughts on this ditch or any of the subjects that we've covered?
I love it. Yeah.
All the thoughts have been had. There are none left.
We have exhausted them. No, that's very good. Well, Noah and Gabriel, I deeply appreciate you being on today and kind of helping us guide us through Dante's Inferno. Where can people find out more about CLT?
Sure. CLTexam.com has all kinds of resources. You can find the journal, which is our blog that Gabriel writes. The Anchored podcast is there. If you haven't been on it, Deacon, you should be soon.
The author bank.
The author bank, practice tests, and there's even pages that link to the ESAs that are popping up in a lot of states, and how you can get connected with the school choice movement that we're well tied into. So.
No, very good. All right, Noah, Gabriel, once again, thank you so much for being on this evening. We really appreciate it. We appreciate all of your insights. Everyone, next week we'll be discussing Cantos 26 through 31. So we'll be finishing the 8th Circle of Hell, and we'll be joined by Dr. Donald Prudlow at the University of Tulsa. And in the interim, you can visit our website at thegreatbookspodcast.com, or we have a guide on Dante's Inferno if you want to kind of get deeper into the text, and we will see you next week.